yet, and I'm part of the school team. And I would like to welcome you all to our last session with Dr. Ravi Ravindra today. Before I hand over to him, may I just remind everyone that tomorrow the school will be hosting Tom Bree with a discussion on Dante's journey in Gothic cathedral design. And on Thursday, we have an exceptional event on a Thursday midweek, which will be Earth Day. And Mary Abdil will be guiding us through that. So if you would like to kindly check the newsletter when it comes through, you'll get all of the times and everything else. Instead today, sadly, we do come to the last part of our seminar with Dr. Ravi Ravindra. And I really strongly suggest, if you do not have it already and would like to continue delving into this great work, to get a copy of his book. And not only because with the wisdom that he has and his way of teaching and expressing such complex concept as we have seen, he has also written a fantastic book on the wisdom of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, The Pilgrim's Soul, and also Silence and the Sacred, as well as other works. So do have a look at those if you like his way of explaining and teaching. And again, for the final time for this particular seminar, though I'm sure we will love to have you with us again, I don't know, we're going to miss having these Saturday afternoons. So thank you very much for being with us, Ravi, and I'm honored to be able to pass over to you for this Saturday.
Thank you very much. Again, it's a good reminder. In fact, Erica even mentioned this last time, that most of your sessions begin with a little bit of meditation. Whatever we understand by meditation is a little bit of a freedom from thinking. Because as Madame Blavatsky said, mind is the slayer of the truth. It really belongs to the opposing team. So to assist it to be a little quiet, connect it with your body, which is much more stable. So maybe if you can now sense the vertical axis in yourself from the top of the head to the base of the spine. Generally, in spiritual teachings, this axis is what is called the axis mundi, the world axis. And also to remind ourselves that the life energy enters into us through breath. This is how a particle of Krishna enters into us, or as the book of Genesis says, God breathed his own breath to make human beings alive. So connect with your breathing and staying in connection with the vertical axis. As you breathe out, the mind can go down the axis. And as you breathe in, it can go up the axis, but in general, to exercise some will, not to let it get away from the axis. But if it does, don't get agitated. Almost with affection, bring it back. It's just a simple reminder that I am being breathed by these very subtle energies which have created me. And simply becoming aware of the fact that breathing is taking place, not to hold my breath outside or inside, but as I pay attention to it, it naturally changes in its quality. Because attention, or other words get used, consciousness, awareness, is said to be representing the particle of divinity in us. But as our time is short, so now just to take 2 more breaths, then I will attend to the chapter at hand. In the very beginning of this chapter, again the question gets raised by Arjuna, who always wants to have one definite answer to something, because the emphasis actually, in fact, in all spiritual teachings, the emphasis is not on what I do, but what I am. So there is, especially in the Bhagavad Gita, very great emphasis on nashkarmya, literally meaning actionlessness. However, we have already spoken about it at length. Nashkarmya is not inaction, but it is more and more freedom from my action. Can my will, can my action become an instrument of Krishna's will or divine will? But Arjuna again raises this very question, whether any action should be undertaken or not. So, as Krishna says, particularly in the shlokas 3 to 6, that acts of yajna, which means sacrifice, or acts of charity and spiritual effort, ought not to be abandoned, because they assist a human being to become wiser. So they should be practiced, but remain unattached to the fruits of action. Because whether an action succeeds or it does not succeed does not wholly depend on you. But still, the call is to become more and more free of my will, my action, my determination. And how can I receive something from the side of higher dimensions or higher levels, from Krishna, from God? Whatever words appeal to you. In the Bhagavad Gita, naturally we use the expression Krishna, because he gradually reveals himself to Arjuna as an incarnation of the highest divinity. But this renunciation of one's self-will is easier said than done. In fact, one of our great sages in India, Ramakrishna, at the end of the 19th century, some of you may have heard his name. Actually, more people seem to have heard of Vivekananda, but he was a disciple of Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna used to say that if you said Gita, Gita, Gita quickly, then it sounds like Tagi, 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 which in Bengali, which was his mother tongue, literally means renouncing, renouncing, renouncing. He said that's the heart of the Bhagavad Gita. For him, all you need to learn, he was not a very learned scholarly type at all, but obviously regarded as a divine incarnation himself in India. So for him, it was very simple. You simply rapidly say Gita, 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 and you got the heart of the whole matter there. Renouncing, renouncing, renouncing. But on the other hand, Krishna actually explicitly then says that whether an action succeeds or it does not succeed depends on many factors. Of course, on the quality of the actor, the quality of the action, and whatever the instruments have been used. But also, this is a very useful word to keep in mind. In Sanskrit, the word is daivam. It also depends on daivam, which will be more or less translated as the benediction of the devas. Devas are very difficult to translate into English. They are closer to, one might say, angels, or they are often get translated as gods in English translations. But the idea is that they are referring to subtler levels of awareness. And they are within us as well as outside us. So that the benediction of the devas is very important whether an action succeeds or does not succeed. I'm sure historically, some of you may be quite aware of this, particularly many examples of this kind in scientific research or scientific history. Many people can have exactly the same data, but somehow one scientist comes up with a theory which is acceptable. For example, Einstein or Newton. It's not that nobody else had that data which they had. Then we have a tendency to say, oh, so-and-so was lucky, or it was his fate. What Krishna is saying, it's not a matter of just randomly somebody being lucky, that it is very much to do with their relationship or their connection with subtler levels of reality. Devam would be a connection with subtler level of reality. Very strong suggestion that whether an action is going to succeed or not succeed doesn't wholly depend on the actor or even the quality of the action. So this is particularly repeated in the shlokas 15 and 16 in this chapter. So I'm just reminding you. And very strong remark in an old Upanishad, Shvetashvatara Upanishad, that's named after the saint or sage Shvetashvatara, who actually says this explicitly, that every human realization depends on human effort, but also the benediction of the devas. If any of you are especially interested in the Sanskrit terminology here, it's tapas prabhav, that's the human effort, as well as deva prasad, benediction from the devas. So this is always a good thing to remember. Then I want to draw your attention particularly to the 17th shloka in the 18th chapter, which is really it speaks about a very dangerous teaching. And the reason I'm saying this, let me read this to you for a moment here. Krishna is saying, one who is free from the ego sense of the doer, whose buddhi is not distorted, even when slaying these people, does not slay and is not bound. Now you see how it can become very dangerous. I remind you simply about 3 years ago, one of the great terrorists in India was actually arrested for having killed some people. And he said, I'm not the slayer. And he quoted this very verse from the Bhagavad Gita. One needs to realize here that the whole background of the Bhagavad Gita so far has been on the transformation of the being of Arjuna, which we will soon speak about, how he goes from saying, my mind is bewildered about dharma, coming to clarity about dharma and what he needs to do, and then submitting himself to the will of Krishna. But that whole transformation is necessary before one can claim or say that whatever I do doesn't have any consequences for me because I am free of my own actions. That's really partly the meaning of Nashkarmya. Have I now become an instrument of Krishna's will, then whatever I do is not going to have consequences for me. I'm not the actor, I'm not the doer. In fact, Krishna repeatedly says this, that those who are not clear-minded, they imagine that they are the doers, whereas it's always the very forces of nature which are acting. And he actually explicitly then goes on to say that I am seated in everybody and turn them around with my power as if on a turning machine. So everybody is being, if you like, turned both by the forces of Prakriti, which is also Krishna as earlier Krishna has said, actually in the 6th chapter, that the lower part of his being is what is Prakriti and the higher part is what is Purusha. He's in everything. In fact, he is everything. I think more than once I have said to you that India doesn't have the myth of creation, but a myth of emanation. Brahma, which is the label for the highest reality, and Krishna then identifies himself with Brahma, did not create the world, it became the world. Therefore, everything has Brahma in it, even a stone, or a mosquito, or a human being. Absolutely everything has some level of consciousness, some level of awareness. That's the description, one of the descriptions of Brahma is consciousness in the great Upanishad. There are 4, maybe I should quickly, not to get too far away from the present situation, but there are 4 enunciations in the Upanishads which are regarded as great enunciations or Mahavakyas. One of them is exactly this, that Brahma is consciousness. This is in the Atriya Upanishad. So it's very important to keep this in mind, that any of these teachings can be very dangerous. As you can well imagine, what has been done in the name of the teaching of Prophet Muhammad or of Christ or of the Buddha, these very days, what's happening in Myanmar. So every teaching can be misused, and always the call is the necessity for the transformation of the person before one can say that I am speaking on behalf of Krishna or behalf of Christ or behalf of the Buddha. So let me remind you again and again that every teaching has the possibility of being misused, which is what is happening in every religious tradition, everywhere, throughout human history. Continuing with this, let me now say, this becomes a very important focus by Krishna, especially emphasized in the shlokas 54 to 56. Impartial to all beings, one discovers supreme love for me, Krishna says. By love, one comes to know me. This is something one may seem, in fact, at a very low level, one may say, why doesn't Krishna make up his mind? What is more important, knowledge or love? But there is always a spiral movement. Krishna actually says, those who are affirmed by knowledge, they love me, and those who love me come to real truth. So it's really always a spiral movement between truth and love. In fact, this is something very important to emphasize. This is one of the difficulties with our scientific truths. There is no reference to love. They're not necessarily against love, but it's not a requirement that scientific truths have love in it. In fact, most of scientific knowledge, or most physical scientists, you probably all know, 90% of them or more, work either for the industry or for the military. Greed and fear. That is what is driving most of this knowledge. So knowledge without, or truth or knowledge without love, similarly, love without knowledge then leads to kind of a sentimentality. So one has to be very careful on both sides. But one of the things that I especially want to mention here quickly, because earlier Krishna has very much said that one of the things that stands in our way, in fact, the most important thing, is kama. Sanskrit word kama. Now, by that, it shifted its meaning from the Rig Veda to the Bhagavad Gita. In the Rig Veda, kama means love. By the time of the Bhagavad Gita, it begins like more or less either sexual love or just selfish desire. Exactly same thing happened in the Greek language. Some of you may know. This is actually a remark of Socrates quoted by Plato, that real philosophy can be done only in a state of eros. But from the time of Plato to the New Testament, the word eros acquired completely a negative feeling, meaning only erotic love. So new words needed for the New Testament, like agape or philia. I mention this because one always needs to be very careful about the words being used once they get translated as love or as desire or as selfish desire. One can get a little stuck. Then reading Plato would make not much sense from that point of view. Or even reading Blavatsky's remark. One of the fundamental four-hats in the secret doctrine is eros. So I remind people, therefore, to be a little careful with some of these words, that from kama in the Rig Veda, it moves to bhakti in the Bhagavad Gita. So what Krishna is saying, one can come to me through a dedicated bhakti. But here I also want to make one other comment. Bhakti, the word that is used in India or by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, definitely has a kind of a spiritual hierarchy in it, unlike agape used by Christ. Christ's expression, you love yourself, he's speaking to his disciples, love yourself as I have loved you. In both cases, the same word agape can be used. But you cannot say that Krishna has bhakti for Arjuna. Arjuna has bhakti for Krishna because of this spiritual hierarchy in it. So bhakti has, in addition to the meaning of love, also meaning like worship, submission, adulation. So keeping that in mind, one should not, because especially a friend of mine has written a whole book just using the word bhakti meaning love, then one can keep equating it with the expression in the New Testament, etc. It can lead to more and more misunderstanding. So let me remind you again here, very strong emphasis, shifting. Remember the first 6 chapters in the Bhagavad Gita, the word bhakti is not even used even once. What is required, special emphasis, is on karma yoga and jnana yoga, meaning learning the right kind of knowledge and the right undertaking, the right kind of action. Then one can be gradually more and more prepared. Otherwise, the whole idea of loving God, it sounds nice, easy to say. More religious warfares have been based on that idea that I'm loving God and God loves me. Of course, it's my own particular God and my own particular relationship with God. So the whole question, and again, I had tried to say this even last time, that it is much more important. You can see this even in the remarks of Christ, certainly in the remarks of Krishna, much more important that we are loved by Krishna or by Christ than that we love them. Because if I wish to love God or love Krishna or love Christ, I don't really, strictly speaking, know what is Christ or what is God or what is Krishna. So one has some mental idea, mental image about it. And all of these teachers repeatedly say, and I'm more or less now quoting it from Christ's remarks in the Gospel of John, by the way, if you're interested, you can look it up. If you love me, you will obey my commandments. Then I will love you as the Father loves me. This is a direct quote from me. And will dwell in you as the Father dwells in me. But there is always literal mindedness. If you can believe it, there are some scholars who say, when Christ says, I will dwell in you, or maybe he had homosexual tendencies. Now, can you believe all this? But I invite you not to be so stupid-minded completely. But there are people who actually do believe like all this kind of thing. But the call in any case is, if I wish or express even a feeling of love for Krishna, am I lovable by him? Remember last time when I spoke, the whole chapter 11 very much, chapter 12 very much emphasizes who is dear to me. Krishna says this repeatedly, and then finally, who is the dearest to me. That is the important part there to keep in mind. Then again, something to remind you, which had, I think I mentioned this practically the first time we met in this gathering here, that the main yoga that Krishna teaches in the Bhagavad Gita is Buddhi Yoga, and much to my surprise, hardly any yoga teachers even seem to mention this. And here is another reminder from Krishna. This is the 57th shloka in the 18th chapter, last chapter. This is what he says: devote yourself fully to me as the supreme. Renounce all your action consciously to me. Take refuge in Buddhi Yoga. Be always one with me in heart and mind. This is the third time he actually mentions Buddhi Yoga as the yoga that he's teaching. In the second chapter, when his teaching begins, in the 10th chapter, which is more or less in the middle of the teaching, and the 18th chapter, which is the end of the teaching. So, but again, I think I had mentioned this, that later on I discovered I had actually published a paper on this in 1979, pointing this out. And it had some academic consequences, many people referring to that paper, etc. But I discovered more than a decade later, a great sage in India, Sri Anirvan, actually had written a whole book called The Buddhi Yoga in the Bhagavad Gita. But it was published originally in Bengali and later on translated in English only in, I think, 2006, if I recall correctly. So it's not that nobody especially notices this, but it doesn't seem to be the popular understanding of the Bhagavad Gita. But it's the Buddhi Yoga, which is really yoga of awareness, from which one can then sometimes see that I need to be undertaking action, or I need to sit down and study something, or I need to sit down and meditate, or I need to go to see if I can worship Krishna, love Krishna, or be loved by him. But none of these are against each other, but they cannot all be practiced at the same time. If I'm sitting in meditation, I cannot be doing any useful action outside, or I cannot be reading a book at that time. So to find my own unique combination of various aspects of different kinds of yoga, if you like, different kinds of undertakings, that is that is possible only if there is an integrated intelligence. That will be another translation of buddhi, integrated intelligence or awareness. It's hard to find one English word to translate this. But I think more than once I have tried to emphasize the word buddhi, because it has both a psychological aspect connected with my psyche. My buddhi is different from your buddhi, but it also has a cosmological, a transpersonal aspect to it. It can see something above itself, and that something above itself is not personal. That's not only for Ravi, it is for everybody. So buddhi has this, like a lookout on a highway, I think was the example I gave earlier. From that lookout, you can see the other side. You can see a mountain which may have snow on it, or you can see lovely growth taking place, but you're still on this side. But from there, you have the ability to see the other side, the cosmological side. Or as Krishna says, buddhi is in the prakriti, our body is the individualized nature, individualized prakriti, but it can be aware of something coming from Purusha, from the spiritual side. So I wanted to draw your attention again to this. This Buddhi Yoga is very much emphasized by him. Then, this is the remark I already actually mentioned to you. This is the 61st shloka. He says, the Lord is is lodged in the heart of all beings, and with his power, he turns them all around and around as if mounted on a machine. So everything that is being done by our body, etc., is also under the power of Krishna, under the power of God. But he says those who don't see this clearly think they are the doers, that they are doing it, their decision is. Question really more is the Prakriti part in me, or the natural part, or the material part in me, my body, my mind, is also part of Krishna. The lower part of Krishna is being driven by him. But so is the spiritual aspect of myself is actually also a particle of Krishna, or breath of God, if you like to use the words in Genesis, the book of Genesis. Then the question is, what is my call? Why am I alive? And the general suggestion is, can I become the connecting link between these two? We will see that Arjuna is being transformed in a way. The call is for Krishna. He repeatedly says to come to Madhbhav, my level of being. That is true. But on the other hand, still in the manifested world, there is the differentiation. He can even come in being to the level of Krishna, but still in the manifested world, he can obey Krishna. Let me give you a specific example of this actually from the Christian tradition. Again, in John's Gospel, which is one of my most favorite Gospels. Actually, I wrote a whole book on this. Christ only once in any Gospel says the Father and I are one. But in the same Gospel, he also says the Father is greater than I, and that I obey the Lord. So to realize his oneness with the Father does not mean to see in the manifested world that he's not always at the same level. He cannot then act in the world. In order to act, he's obeying the will of God. Similarly here, we would see at the very end, that is the call. Arjuna, if he has actually been transformed truly, Krishna has repeatedly said, come to my level of being, Madhbhav. On the other hand, then Arjuna becomes the connecting link between Krishna and the usual world. So that is now speaking more individually. We have the forces and the energies from the material side being manifested in my body, in my mind. But from the spiritual side, which is occasionally experienced or understood by my buddhi, usually in very quiet moments, because the mind is otherwise interfering with it. But occasionally, in moments of great feeling, which can be sometimes moments of great sorrow even. For example, if a close friend dies, temporarily, great feeling takes over. And true feeling, similarly, it can be a feeling of great joy also, seeing a little child just being born. So, in all spiritual teachings, enhanced feeling is said to be the first avenue to truth, not the mind, ordinary mind. But then from that enhanced feeling, one may even come to very clear mind, like the Buddha mind. So don't be against the mind either, but mind has many levels, just as feelings have many levels. I can have a feeling of just jealousy, competitiveness. That's not going to lead me to anything subtle. But feeling of wonder, of compassion, of love, of gratitude. I often invite people because there is nobody in the present audience here who has never experienced these, but impartially look at yourself. Last 1 month, how many moments did you have of a sense of wonder, sense of gratitude, sense of love? I look at myself and have to confess that very few moments of this. So we see that if and when we are deeply touched by some real feeling, real or subtle higher feeling of the kind I'm just mentioning to you, that is actually the avenue to connecting with Krishna or with God, or connecting with something subtler, higher. So repeatedly, this and love needs to be understood in that context. When Krishna speaks about only love, through love you can know me, or bhakti. Otherwise, of course, my lower part is also being driven by Krishna, like a machine, as he says. So the call is for me to become the connecting link, not to be against my body or mind. It is meant to be the instrument to assist the will of Krishna. Why be against the instrument? But the question is it being an instrument just for itself, or is it actually being occasionally listening to and carrying out whatever it understands is the will of Krishna through me? So let me return to some of the other remarks of Krishna here. Then the 4 shlokas, 63rd to 66, are called in Sanskrit the Paramavakya. These are regarded as the heart of Krishna's teaching. At least in the Indian tradition, this is a fairly common expression to refer to these 4 shlokas. And I will take time to reflect on each one of them slightly separately. The first one, Krishna says, I have expounded to you the sacred knowledge, which is profounder than the most profound knowledge. Reflect on it without leaving anything out. Then do what you wish. This is important to emphasize. Actually, a very well-known scientist in India once said to me in a conversation that for him, this is the most important shloka in the Bhagavad Gita. Because Krishna is not asking us to just obey something that he's saying. He's teaching something. And then he's asking us to reflect on everything without leaving anything out. But then we do what we wish. If my action does not come from my understanding, I'm just merely obeying something, then this is not what Krishna is asking for. He's not against obedience. He's not, but obedience only if he's teaching something, do I understand what he's teaching? Can I then come from me? So this is regarded, as I said, this scientist particularly thought this was the most important shloka in the whole of the Bhagavad Gita. Don't reflect on everything without leaving anything out, then do what you wish. Whereas I think there is a contrast. You look at any of the prophets in the Bible, inevitably they are commanded by God to do something and they have no choice. You can look at Prophet Moses or Abraham or Prophet Muhammad or any of the other prophets. They are really, in fact, quite rightly, they submit to God, that is true, but they have no choice about it. They're not asking for it. They're not looking for it. They're not searching for it. So God finds them. In fact, that maybe I know occasionally people, particularly feminine theologians, get upset why God is called he in the Judeo-Christian tradition, not in the Indian tradition. And I try to remind people that actually in the biblical tradition, the emphasis is very much that the major initiative comes from God. And generally, traditionally, activity is associated with males and receptivity with females. Therefore, he gets called he. I have never heard any Christian theologian trying to describe this, but they just carry on their own thing. But I personally have tried to approach this without trying to be argumentative, trying to understand why this is such an important emphasis in the whole of the tradition. And my understanding It arises precisely because almost every activity is initiated by God. This is not the case in India. For example, the Buddha, he's searching for something because he's struck by something terrible. You never see anybody indicating a searching for something in the biblical tradition. It's always as if they are smitten by God, they are struck by God, called by God. This is quite a different emphasis. I have a whole book on this, by the way, if you're interested, called Whispers from the Other Shore, Spiritual Search East and West, where I try to see what is common to all of these traditions. And there are many things which are common, but there are many things which are fundamentally different, and they affect the culture very much strongly, very strongly. Okay, let me come back to the four Paramavakyas, or the regarded as the essential teachings. The next one is, hear from me, profound of all mysteries, the supreme word, you are my beloved with a steadfast heart. Therefore, I will speak for your good. This is important to emphasize, that because Arjuna is beloved by Krishna, therefore Krishna can reveal himself to him. This is what I tried to say earlier. More important that I am loved by Krishna than that I love Krishna. Simple example, I think I may have mentioned this last time as well. If a child says to the mother or the father, I love you, it has different meaning, different implication than if a father or a mother says to a child, I love you. One can use the same words, but here, if Krishna loves Arjuna, he has earlier tried to say why somebody is loved by him. Then he can reveal his teaching. This is important. As Socrates said, only in the presence of eros can there be true philosophy. And so this is one of the important. And then he says, truth can descend to us. No, sorry, I skipped a section here. Let me come back here. That it's not that Arjuna needs to be loving Krishna. One can begin that way. It's more closer to worshipping, submitting to Krishna, listening to Krishna, obeying what Krishna is saying. Then Krishna can love him. This is where it's very important to be clear that every teaching actually says you cannot come to God, but God can come to you. Or that you can, let me quote Krishnamurti's remark, truth can descend to you. You cannot ascend to the truth with a capital T. But then the question really is anything required from my side? I may have mentioned this earlier also. Actually, when Krishnamurti had said this once in my hearing, I said to him, Krishnaji, should I just go and have another beer, or is anything required from me? How come truth hasn't descended on me so far? This is where I think one can sometimes get a little too forget. It's the continuing debate in the Christian tradition between effort and grace. Sometimes one forgets that ultimately it is a matter of grace. It's not a question of my conquering God or my conquering truth and walking into heaven with my boots on. No, it's ultimately really is a matter of submission, that every teaching speaks about it, every teacher speaks about it. But the question really more is there anything required from my side to prepare myself, my body, my mind, to become more and more receptive to what may come from the other side? But every great insight for any scientist, every great poem by anybody is always coming from the other side. The question is one prepared to receive it? So it's not that nothing is required from our side. I know sometimes some people, and like Krishnamurti was one good example. always emphasizing only truth can descend to you, almost as if nothing needs to be done by me, which I don't think he really meant that quite, but he didn't express what was required from my side. Okay, so again and again call by Krishna anyway, be my lover, worshipper, sacrifice to me, bow to me, then you will come to me. This is the next great. I told you there are these four. This is the third one. And the last one is the 66th one. Often in India, actually, people would even pronounce this in Sanskrit. Sarva dharman parityajam mam ekam sharanam braj. Aham tvam sarva papebhyo mokshishyami ma shuchi. Leave all dharmas aside. Come only to me. Now remember, dharma means duty, responsibility, obligation. So leave all your duties and obligations aside. Come only to me. I will deliver you from all evil. Do not worry or do not be troubled. Now, this is actually, I think, when I had initially spoken about the importance of dharma, this whole book is regarded, actually the whole Mahabharata. Bhagavad Gita is just one of the books in the great epic Mahabharata. The whole Mahabharata is regarded as a dharma text. And Krishna himself, the very first word is dharma in the Bhagavad Gita. And at the end, Krishna actually asks Arjuna, have you listened to our dialogue about dharma carefully? So in a way, it is supporting dharma, but dharma can have many levels. And yoga is required in order to understand all the various levels. Therefore, sometimes there is a bit of a tension between yoga and dharma. Because yoga ultimately ends up saying, don't do anything. Just be in the presence of Krishna, be in love of Krishna, which is what he actually ends up saying here. So leave all your dharmas aside, come only to me. Now, dharma also means support. That's another meaning of the word dharma. The word for the earth, dharti, and dharma come from the same root. So leave all your supports aside, meaning relying on this scripture or that idea or that weapon or that understanding. Leave all that aside, Krishna says, come only to me. I will deliver you from all evil. This, as I said, is a very highly regarded shloka in the Bhagavad Gita, and quite understandably. But it is very important to keep in mind that the first remark that Krishna actually made to Arjuna, when Arjuna says, my mind is bewildered about dharma, Krishna emphasized to carry out your dharma. So it's a question of understanding different levels of dharma. And now he's saying you can leave all your dharmas aside. So it will be quite silly to imagine that without understanding what my dharma is, how can I actually be free of it? Only I can be free of it only if I'm actually carrying out, if you like, Krishna's dharma, Krishna's will. Then I can abandon my dharma. Otherwise, it can become very easy to say, I don't need to do anything, or I do whatever I wish to do, etc., etc. So it's very important to bear in mind that in a way there is a certain kind of tension in Krishna very much emphasizing following your dharma, swadharma. I think I mentioned this earlier as well, which corresponds to your own essential being, which is what ultimately Arjuna does. After listening to all this great teaching, what is Arjuna doing? He's actually fighting in the battle, which corresponds to his swadharma. So he's not abandoning his dharma in that sense, but now he's doing this as part of Krishna's will, not as a part of his will. So then let me come back to the more or less the end of it here. What is the transformation of Arjuna? This is what he says at the very end. I stand firm, my doubts are dispelled, I will act by your word, or I will carry out your will. which is what I said in a way, in a manner of speaking, he has come to the level of understanding of Krishna, but still in the world, now he has to carry out the will of Krishna in the world, which is basically to say he can now become the connecting link between the level of Krishna and the level of the world, a warrior. So he was already a skillful warrior, but now he's fighting not for his victory, not on his behalf, but on Krishna's behalf. And this is really the call to us. How can I become the intermediary or the connecting link between something higher than my usual self and, of course, the energy of my usual self? So to become the connecting link, or as my own teacher actually said, you see the other shore and you are on this shore, how can you become the water connecting the two? Another way of putting it, which is a little different analogy, it is important to be a warrior and a monk simultaneously. A warrior is skillfully able to fight, and a monk knows when to stop fighting and to pray, and then when to fight. So how to be both Arjuna and Krishna simultaneously? This is the last shloka in the Bhagavad Gita. Sanjay, who is actually describing all this, he's the one saying it. This is not said either by Krishna or by Arjuna, but Sanjay is actually saying that only when the skillful warrior Arjuna is there and the Lord of Yoga Krishna is there, then there will be victory and prosperity. This is the very last shloka in the Bhagavad Gita, which is another way of saying it, that without God, it cannot be done, but without human beings, it will not be done. So the call really is, can I hear what God wants me to do and carry it out in the world? So there is certainly no suggestion in the Bhagavad Gita, which is really what makes it a unique text in the whole of the Indian culture. There is not a shortage of spiritual texts in India, hundreds of them. But what is unique about the Bhagavad Gita, that it deals with all the activities in a human person: love, knowledge, meditation, action, everything. Fighting, retreating, everything. So, and furthermore, the call is not, Krishna never asks Arjuna to not fight, but not simply to fight for his victory or for his achievement, but can he see how he can fulfill the will of Krishna coming from a different level. So this, in my understanding, is really the call for all of us to find both our Arjuna and our Krishna and to become the connecting link between the two. And the suggestion is that both of them exist in every human being, or the way Krishna speaks about it, that the lower part of him is, or Prakriti is also a part of him. That's the lower part of him. Then the Purusha is the higher part of him. But he is in everything and is everything. But in the manifested world, which is where we are, I need to be aware of both of these forces or energies. One, or a current of energy coming from above, one coming from below. How do I find their correct or right combination? So I will stop here now to invite